us. And Mark Dunkelman is going to share some wisdom from his book about the vanishing American neighbor and what it means to be a neighbor in this weird time that we're inhabiting. So Mark, take it away.
Thank you. So,
and just once again, you're on Facebook Live. If anybody doesn't want their picture on, just stop your video, okay?
Got it.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm always happy to talk about this. My book is now, I think, came out in April of 2014, so it's 6 years old, but I think it sort of holds up. We'll see what you all think. I haven't done this review, so I took out my old notes for this talk, and I'm going to try to go through it fairly quickly so we can have more of a discussion than me talking. I'm thrilled to do it in part because, you know, I am a writer and I live at home and I work at home. And so, you know, Temple Bethel really is one of my, you know, few experiences out in the community of Providence. And so to talk about community with my community is a thrill. So let me just sort of begin by sort of explaining to you my background. I worked in Washington for a lot of years before we moved here in 2013. And my first job actually was working for Joe Biden. And I was a staff assistant, the lowliest of the low. I used to pour the waters at Judiciary Committee hearings when he was the chair. And I also organized the closet sometimes. Nevertheless, I felt pretty impressed with myself that I was working for Joe Biden back in the day. This is back in 2000, back in the early 2000s. And I'd fly back home to see my folks in Buffalo, where they lived. And my father would always ask me questions like, why doesn't Washington work? And each time, sort of very impressed with myself, I'd come back with, you know, whatever I'd read in the newspaper earlier that day. So I would say something like, it's too much money in politics. And my father would sort of sit back in his chair and say to me, Mark, that's a really interesting theory, but money is not new to politics, right? You know, Lyndon Johnson won the presidency on the independent, you know, from independent oil money, and the DuPonts gave $100,000 in 1916 to Woodrow Wilson's opponent because he was introducing an income tax. So why is it that it used to be that politics works and now it doesn't? And I think to myself, that's actually a pretty good counter argument. And I'd go back to Washington and I'd come back to Buffalo eventually. And he asked me the same question. I'd say, Dad, you know, it's gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is terrible. They have these members and they get to pick their districts rather than the district picking the member. And he'd say, Mark, isn't gerrymandering named after Elbridge Gerry, who was literally James Madison's vice president? That can't be the new thing. And so I'd go back and I came back and I'd say, it's the filibuster, Dad. It's the filibuster, which is the rule of a minority of senators to hold up a bill. And he'd say, but Mark, the filibuster rules today are the same filibuster rules they were in the 1970s. Why is it now? And I eventually gave up, right? My father won that argument, but it stuck with me. And so for years, I would read about this and try to think, what is it that's happened? What's changed? And I noticed as I was thinking about this, that it wasn't just that faith in government, it's that faith in all the institutions of American life had begun to dissipate. And that extended not only from government, but to courts, to banks, to big business, to, you know, our educational system, even houses of worship. Were inspired less confidence in the 2000s and, you know, even today than they had generations earlier. And I began to think to myself, you know, we go around, you know, Jews go around asking why fewer people go to synagogue, and teachers talk about why there isn't the respect for school systems that there used to be. And we all look inside these institutions, what happened? What's changed? And I began to think, you know, if we all woke up tomorrow and discovered that that half the buildings in Seattle, San Diego, Miami, and Boston had all been painted lime green over the course of the previous evening, we'd all think, what happened in all these places together? we wouldn't do an investigation at each individual place. So I began thinking to myself, is there some sort of common theme here? Is there something that's happened in America? And so this is where I started sort of futzing around with the sociological literature. And I came to a theory, but to sort of explain it, I want to sort of go back to my childhood, which was that I grew up in Buffalo. My parents moved to Buffalo. My father ran the Jewish nursing home in Buffalo, but they had grown up in Cincinnati. So every holiday, we would drive back down to Cincinnati from Buffalo, and my father would pick up his father, my grandfather, and my uncle, and they would drive down a street called Rose Hill, where my father had grown up. And they would drive very slowly. And they would look at each house, and they would tell me the story of the family that lived in that house. Who went to great college, who died of a drug abuse, who was a cheerleader, who was a spelling bee star. They knew the whole story. And I realized when I got back to Buffalo that I didn't have that experience at all. And I presumed through the course of my childhood that the distinction was between Buffalo and Cincinnati, that somehow Cincinnati was closer to the South, or I had all sorts of different theories. And then years later, I had a conversation with someone who'd grown up in Buffalo, whose father had grown up in Buffalo, and he'd grown up somewhere else. And he said, I have the same experience, except that my father, who grew up in Buffalo, knew all of his neighbors back in the 40s and 50s. And I didn't know any of my neighbors where I grew up. And that the distinction was time, it wasn't place, that something had changed. So I began to try to think, is there some connection between the loss of faith in all these institutions on the one hand, politics, courts, houses of faith, education, etc., and what seemed to me to be a sea change in the way we were connected to the people who were near, we lived near. And so I began looking through the sociological literature. There's this terrific story written or sort of discovered by a famous sociologist named Jim Coleman, who looked at the Hasidim in New York. And he was looking for a diamond used in the diamond district. And he walked into a shop in Manhattan and went in. And as he was sort of searching around looking for some jewelry, a guy came in and said, "Here, do you want these?" And the guy behind the counter said, "Give them to me." And he took them, put them behind the counter, and the guy walked out. And Coleman said to himself, "This is odd. Like, how does he have faith that this guy's going to appraise them correctly? Or how can he leave?" It happened a second time. Another guy came in, dropped off a bag of gems, walked out. And finally, Coleman went to the guy who was behind the counter. "What's going on here? I don't understand." And the guy said, "You have to understand, I know all of these guys back from my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And if I were to exchange out the gems that they'd given me for other gems, word would hit the street. And not only would I be ostracized here in the diamond community as a thief, but back home, there'd be a social impact for me back home." And so this was where Coleman comes up with this phrase, which is now associated with a scholar named Robert Putnam, but Coleman comes up with it, called social capital, which is this idea that there is real value in the idea of being connected to other people. And that we talk about human capital, and we talk about money, and we talk about all these things that have intrinsic value, but that these connections are actually very valuable. What happened was that term social capital became very public when a book called Bowling Alone came out right around the year 2000. And the theory behind Bowling Alone, was a guy, political scientist at Harvard named Robert Putnam, came out with this book. And the argument was that those sorts of the connections in America had diminished over the course of the second half of the 20th century. That people weren't going to the PTA, that people weren't going to bridge, that they weren't involved in civic affairs, they weren't going to neighborhood associations and these sorts of things. And that was the cause of all sorts of problems in American life. And I began thinking about that theory and wanted to modify it for this reason. I don't think that we are less connected on the whole, but I do think that we are all investing our time and attention in different sorts of relationships than we used to. That it used to be So let me go through sort of the core of my theory. If you take everyone you know, every person in your social universe, and we're asked to graph them onto a model that looks like the rings of Saturn. You're the planet, and on these rings, you place people at the level of intimacy they are in your life. So your most intimate connections, your spouse, your children, your parents, your best friends are in the innermost rings. And then moving further and further out are people, so that in the outermost ring is maybe, I don't know, the barista that you said hello to that morning and will probably never talk to again. The basic thesis of my book is that over the course of the last half century, we've done three things. The first is that we've invested much more in our innermost rings, which is to say that we are spending more time with the people that we love most. You know, when my grandfather left for work in the morning in Cincinnati in the 1930s and 40s, he would kiss my grandmother goodbye, and they wouldn't talk probably until he got home. Now, when my wife leaves for work, I mean, she texts me when she gets there, I text her back, we're in touch all day, every day. And the truth is that my best friends, I've never been in better touch with them. My parents talk to my children on FaceTime all the time. The strength of ties between the people that we know best have never been tighter. The second thing that's happened is that we are now much more closely connected to people who are in the outermost rings. So people with whom we share a single common interest. I like to joke that I am one of 17 Cincinnati Bengals fans in the entire world, and we all know each other today. I live in Rhode Island. Cincinnati is probably the worst football team, professional football team in America. It doesn't have a lot of fans, but I know all the others, and we're constantly going back and forth on Twitter or wherever it is. So that's that is true of people who share all sorts of interests. You know, my daughter, who is now home from school, is learning to knit. She's now knitting every day on an online class. She's now very connected to those people. And the truth is, those relationships don't mean a great deal to her, in the sense that she's not going to necessarily stay connected to those people if she loses interest in knitting, or in the case of if there were a family emergency, she wouldn't go to those people and ask for support. But those connections are dominating more of her time and attention. The third thing that happens because of this shift is that we are abandoning what I call middle ring relationships, which are the relationships that are not intimate, but are more than familiar. So these are the people that you saw at the PTA, in a bowling league, at a bridge tournament, at Temple every Friday night or Saturday. And the sort of the upshot of it is that the sorts of people that you knew well enough to say something sort of more substantial than, what do you think of the weather? Or isn't this virus terrible? Or something that sort of everyone's experiencing, that you could say, you know, I heard your mother fell down as she recovered, or I heard your daughter was, you know, struggling with French. Did you find a tutor? If you bumped into them at a coffee shop, you'd have something sort of more substantial to say to them. Those sorts of relationships have withered. That is, you know, that is not meant to be an indictment of people, of choices. I think, you know, if you'd asked my grandfather, he had the opportunity in 1955 to spend more time with his family and more time with people who shared his particular interests, would he have chosen to invest more of his time and attention in those relationships than the relationships that he built with people who were in the neighborhood, say with my grandmother, but people of that vintage, that they might have made the same choice, but that we are individually making choices to invest less on the whole in these middle ring relationships than we did a generation ago. And it's very hard to measure this. One of the I think, not the Achilles heel, but one of the weaknesses of my book is that there's much more qualitative information in it than quantitative, but there is some quantitative analysis. The General Social Survey is this long-running survey of sociological data, and they ask people, they've been asking people for decades, who have you had a social evening with over the course of the last month? And it, even in this moment where everyone talks about loneliness and isolation and society's going away, they ask people, have you eaten with a member of your family? And the percentage of people who have eaten with a member of their family over the course of the last month have gone up. You ask people, have you eaten with a friend who lived more than a mile away? And it turns out that people are more frequently having meals together with people who live further from them. But if you ask people, when's the last time you had a meal with someone in your neighborhood? That has actually diminished. So that was sort of the best quantitative evidence I had for this larger shift. And that was well. So that I'll leave it there. And if you want more quantitative data, you have to buy my book. The upshot of all of this, getting back to my father's question from years and years ago, was that I think that this shift, our decision to abandon these middle-ring relationships has all sorts of ripple effects across society. So I see Sam Zurier is on the line, and here there's someone from the political world who can maybe speak to this. But there is a tendency in the world now of politics to blame dysfunction on any number of factors, as we said at the beginning: money in politics, the filibuster, gerrymandering, whatever it is. And my supposition is that, in fact, what's happening is that middle rings were the space, and those were the relationships where we learned about what people on the other side of any political divide thought. So that if you're in the line at the coffee shop and you're a liberal academic at Brown and you're having a conversation with someone you know from the neighborhood who's an independent business owner, you begin having a conversation and the liberal academic starts talking about intersectionality and inequality and the topics that are often the subject of academic conversation. And the independent business owner who owns the coffee shop or owns a small business starts talking about regulation and government red tape, and it's impossible to work at the state, and the city is up my, preventing me from expanding my business and all. And it's not that the two of them in this conversation abandon their own viewpoint, but by talking to someone in the flesh, in person, having a conversation, having a back and forth that isn't on Twitter, right, which is an outer ring relationship, and isn't, talking to your crazy relative at Thanksgiving, who's an inner ring relationship, but you don't really care what they have to say. That in these middle ring relationships, you begin to appreciate, even if you don't agree with the other side, what the other side is, why they think that. And that if your experience in those middle ring relationships is, I don't really agree with the other side, but I understand at least where they're coming from. I understand it's not totally bananas. That you will accept from your own representative in the city council or the state legislature or in Congress their willingness to work with the other side. But if in your own everyday experience, you're only talking to people who you agree with in the outer rings, or you're only talking to people who you don't really discuss politics, or you already know what they think in the inner rings, and your only news sources are sort of are outer and inner ring places, then you're not willing to abide by the ethos of compromise and collaboration that is sort of burnishes how a legislature has to work. So that the real shift is less in these political institutions that are exclusively in the world of politics and more woven into these sort of the changes in everyday life. There's I realize I'm at 25 minutes in and I don't want to go much longer than this. There's a terrific experiment by a political scientist named Jim Fishkin he gave it a terrible name, which was deliberative polling. He did this about 20 years ago. But the basis of the idea was that he used to take a community that was divided on some sort of local issue. Should we raise taxes? Should we impose a plastic bag, fee? Should we, any issue that divided a community? And he would invite a representative sample of the community to a big hotel. And he would take a poll of the community on this issue, and then he would divide it proportionally into groups of 10 or 20 people, and make sure that there were people from various sides in each group. And he would give the group a couple of hours to talk about it. Sometimes he would allow them to have some experts on both sides of the issue come and talk. And then he would re-poll them at the end. He called it this deliberative polling. And what he found was that 75% of the time, the poll at the beginning of the conference, at the end of the conference, was substantially different. That having a thoughtful conversation with people from the other side changed people's point of view. It wasn't that everyone abandoned their own inclination from the beginning. It wasn't, but it wasn't that people completely switched sides or that there was a clear winner. But it was that simply the act of talking to someone who you developed some sort of trust with, who you talked to and accepted that they were operating in good faith, changed the way people thought about issues. And the supposition, and I think I'll probably leave it here, is that I think he was creating sort of in an artificial way the sorts of bonds that used to emerge organically in the course of everyday American life. And so I've sort of focused on politics here because we're in an explicitly political moment, but there's been this shift, and I'd be interested to hear what all of you think. There's been this shift. The core idea, to sort of reiterate, is that we've had this enormous shift without anyone noticing it, where it's not that we're disconnected, but we're connected to different sorts of people. We're less connected to our neighbors, we're less connected to people that we know in a familiar but not intimate way, and more connected to people we know really well, and alternatively, we know across a single plane of common interest, and that this is having all sorts of effects. So that was the book. It came out 6 years ago. I'm interested to hear what other folks have to say, and I'm happy to take questions, and it's always fun to reminisce, but eager to hear what people think and what their own experiences are.
I can either you can type your question in the chat box and I can read it, or we're a small enough group that I would invite folks to just unmute yourself and ask your question, or share your experience on that way.
Hi, Mark. I'm Lynn Rakitansky. I have lived in my house for 29 plus years. I am now not the oldest person on the street, but the one who has lived here the longest. It's a 1-block street with 7 houses and 3 on the ends. And we are a very close neighborhood. A new person just moved in, and I added her to our email list. And because we can't really get together right now, I gave her a list of the names of who lived in which houses and added her to the email list. Didn't share phone numbers because I thought if people wanted to do that on their own, that was a little, I don't know, too private at the moment. Most of us have each other's phone numbers, but welcomed her to the neighborhood. Over the years, if somebody had a child, gave birth to a child, for 6 weeks, twice a week, we would bring meals. If somebody had a death in the family, when my dad died, they brought me meals for 6 weeks. It's a really close neighborhood, and it's been wonderful living here this long.
Well, Lynn, I'd love to hear that. I moved to Providence from DC almost explicitly to ensure that my children had a place where they would grow up knowing their neighbors. My experience in DC, I lived in an area with my wife called DuPont Circle, which is 20 blocks north of the White House. And I lived in an old cut up brownstone. And the rumor was that it was a brownstone where William Howard Taft's doctor had lived, and he had been called in the middle of the night to help Taft wedge his way outside of a bathtub. I think that was probably apocryphal, but that was always the rumor. The brownstone had been cut up into 8 apartments, and my wife and I lived in one of them. We had our first child there. We had our dog, and I noticed at one point, having lived there for several years, that I didn't know some of the people in the building. And in fact, some days we would come in and out of the building, pass each other on the stairs, and the person would look at me. I couldn't even make eye contact, say hello or nod hello or say hello. And more than that, I would walk already around the same blocks every morning. And rarely did I say hello to anybody. And that was sort of this, it wasn't an explicitly cold neighborhood, right? You had all the things that the new urbanists say that we need, right? We had bike lanes, and we had mass transit in the neighborhood, and we had lots of coffee shops, and there are all sorts of opportunities for people to connect, but they were choosing not to do it. My experience in Providence, it's interesting as you go street to street here, the experiences are very different. I don't mind saying this to my Temple Bethel community, but I live on Rhode Island Avenue, which is a few blocks south of the Temple. And, when we were buying, our real estate agent said to us, I think they've been holding a block party here on this street since the 50s, which I think may not be apocryphal. I think that may actually be true. And there is a warmth here. But you talk to people on other streets here, and they don't have that experience, right? Young families say, there's shut-ins in that house, and I've never seen them, or people aren't friendly. It really is street to street, and I'm sure that was true in Washington as well. There are people who knew everyone in their building, and there are warm buildings and warm streets. The thesis of my book is that in the aggregate across all sorts of neighborhoods all across America, that we are on the whole choosing to invest less in these middle ring relationships, which isn't to say that there aren't, streets where middle ring relationships are strong, and aren't people who still make these connections a lot. But in the aggregate, that's different. But great to hear about your experience on your street.
Hi, Mark. Karen Eisenberg. I have that polar opposite experience on my street, and the former street I lived on in Providence. It's interesting because I grew up in the South, and there in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I grew up, it's mostly suburban sprawl. So there are developments that are neighborhoods, like they have a cute name. I grew up in Quail Meadows. Across a main street was Quail Hollow. You lived in these developments or these neighborhoods. And growing up, I knew a lot of people in my neighborhood, and it was multiple streets. Maybe that was a factor of my mom being a social butterfly and a different time period. But there was this kind of feeling of knowing all the kids in your neighborhood and playing with them. And of course, it was a different time when, we were out riding our bikes, and my mom didn't, bye, we're going on our bikes, and see you later, we'll come back for dinner. But what I find interesting in Providence is there's, because all of our kids go to a multitude of schools. In other places, the neighborhood might be centered around the neighborhood school. But here, a challenge in building those neighborhood relationships are that our children often don't go to the same school. And on any given street in Providence, we might be representing several different schools, be it the public schools, be it a charter school, be it independent private school, religious school. And so that's just, I think, a factor for here, and particularly here. But anyway, my question though is about, how do you think this kind of abandoning the middle ring then impacts building a community at a synagogue? And I think that's something that we think about and discuss in terms of like our membership and how do we engage people. But it seems to me, based on your definition, that like a temple relationship would be in that middle ring.
So it certainly can be. One of the things that's happened in the literature on the way people worship has changed. It used to be that people tended to worship at and this is certainly largely outside of Judaism, but people tended to worship at a congregation that was near to their home. Almost regardless of whether the liturgy spoke to them personally. And today, Americans are much more willing to travel a further distance to find a community of people who share their exact sort of ideological inclination. So that it used to be that all the Methodists from one area all congregated in one church, but now if you're a Methodist and you don't really like the pastor at that church, you go further afield. And so that what ends up happening is that the congregations are sort of almost more monocultural rather than multicultural. Now that has its sort of upsides and its downsides, right? People in the congregations are more likely to be more similar to each other, which may build bonds. On the other hand, it may be that they are more, that there's less interest because everyone's sort of similar, and you're less likely to have a congregation that is some Democrats and some Republicans and some conservatives and some progressives and a whole mix of people. So from a political point of view, right? If you're looking at my thesis sort of through a political lens, and you're interested in having a people who have different ideological inclinations and different experiences coming together and talking across the middle rings, it's less likely to happen. But the point you bring up, I don't know that I've got any sage advice on what congregations can do, but I do think that the core question is, do people want these middle ring relationships, right? It sounds terrific in a forum like this, and generally when I talk about things, people have a sense of nostalgia for the sorts of experiences you had in North Carolina, of your mother being such a butterfly and you knew all these kids from around the neighborhood, or wasn't it wonderful when everybody knew, everyone's kids went to the same local elementary school, so you met each other at the PTA meeting and you all sent each other, and they were all in the same T-ball team, and et cetera, et cetera. But there is sort of this, the thing about middle ring relationships is they are explicitly uncomfortable in many cases, right? An inner ring relationship, right? It's someone that you know and love and you're very close to, and no matter what you say, that relationship is going to survive. An outer ring relationship with someone who only shares through some single common interest with you, that you know on Twitter or through a blog or you email with, if that common interest dissipates, if you're no longer interested in that, in how to crochet or in the Cincinnati Bengals or in whatever subject is that brought you together, that relationship just sort of flits away and no one thinks about it. In the middle rings, it gets very uncomfortable, right? You're at the soccer, you're on the sidelines of a soccer game. You have a conversation with somebody. It turns out that they voted for the other candidate in 2016. Do you want to have another conversation with them? What's going to happen to the next soccer game? What's going to happen the next time you're at synagogue when you see them? Do you want to sit next to them? Do you not want to sit next to them? Are you going to? So I think that one of the interesting things about this is that it's not just sort of the structure of how community works in America today. It's that our own individual predilections of what do we want? Do we want to have the discomfort or the risk of having a close middle-term relationship? Or given our druthers, would we like to invest more in our closest relationships or in these people who have a single common interest? And so, anyway, that I don't know if that answers your question of what a congregation should do, but one of the I think one of the challenges here is not just that society has somehow changed and we've all stayed the same. It's that our own individual inclinations have changed, and we sort of all need to adapt to that. Institutions need to adapt to that.
Mark, I have two more questions from the chat box for you. And then I see Roz raised her hand and Sam, right? In that order. Okay, I see you. I'm trying to have like the eyes on all sides of my head here. So I'll give you, do you want both questions at once or do you want one at a time?
I think one at a time. My memory's not
okay.
great.
I hear you. Boy, mine neither these days. Okay, the first one is from Harry's iPad here. Any thoughts on the relationship of the shift in social capital and the rise in social media? And when you're done with that, I have one more from Nancy, and then we'll go Roz and Sam in that order. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, absolutely. So I think that the various technologies that we have today all lend themselves to different sorts of relationships. So we think it's sort of strange. We think of the iPhone and texting as a technology that allows us to connect with anyone in the world instantaneously. We're texting all sorts of people. Turns out that the vast majority of texts are between a very small number of people, right? It's we think that we're going to text someone in China or text someone in Canada or wherever. We're texting dad for a ride home, right? Like that's basically what text is for. So text is a very inner ring focused kind of technology, and my wife and I are texting all during the day, and I think a lot of people are texting their kids or their parents. That's what makes that possible. Twitter or Facebook, those are technologies that explicitly make it possible for us to connect much more thoroughly with the outer rings. So my Cincinnati Bengals rooting buddies, we're all on Twitter. And in many cases, that's terrific, right? If we want all the epidemiologists around the world to be able to be connected and sharing ideas in these various technologies, even if they're not friends, right? We want to ease that sort of communication, and that's terrific. That's how social media changed it. The issue here, in many cases, I like to think of how you invest your social capital, your time and attention. I may have lost you for a second. I like to think of it explicitly as a sort of almost like a murder mystery with motive and opportunity. And one of the things, social media has been an expansion in opportunity. We now have more opportunities than ever before to connect with all sorts of different people. So the portfolio of possible investments has expanded. The X factor is motive. Are we inclined, with our limited time and attention, to invest it in the sorts of relationships that our grandparents invested it in? Or are we inclined to invest it in a different portfolio? And so the social media aspect has to do with the former, the number of opportunities and the breadth of opportunity that we have. And the operative question then becomes, how do we choose to invest it? I hope that answers that question. I think you're muted.
Nancy's question is, let's see, let me just scroll down here. How do you see social distancing impacting future relationships with neighbors? What will it look like, quote unquote, after COVID?
So I've just written a piece on this. We'll see whether it ever gets published. And the thesis of the piece is, I have no idea. The thesis of the piece, which may make it of limited interest to an editor. It cuts both ways. One is, as some people have said to me, suddenly, one of the things that's so remarkable about this moment is that we're all having the same experience, right? We're all caught in our homes. We're all, dealing with children. Those of us at least that have children at home, and these challenges are cutting across the sorts of divisions that typically exist, right? Across racial boundaries, socioeconomic differences, geographic differences. You talk to someone from a different ethnicity or a race who lives in a different part of the country, who makes a different income. They're also dealing with, if they have kids the same age, they're dealing with many of the same challenges. Probably, maybe different. Maybe they do have access to great Wi-Fi or don't, or have the technology to do distance learning. But the same experience of having a whiny 6-year-old coming at you every 20 minutes. We can bond over that. Maybe that will bring us closer together. By the other hand, in a moment where the operative term that is guiding society is social distancing, it would be remarkable if that brought us closer together, it seems to me, right? So it may be, I've got a neighbor here on my street who I check in on. He's in his mid-90s, and we've gotten his groceries a couple of times. We knew him pretty well beforehand, and maybe we will know him even better now. But it seems to me that it's also possible that the degree to which we now become accustomed to having groceries delivered or purchasing from Amazon rather than local bookstore, or we become more engaged in, online gaming, or we choose to have a Netflix on Friday rather than going to the movie theater, that our increasing the sense now that we can do many of the things that we used to do that would have, in situations that would have bred middle ring relationships, whether it's going to the PTA or going to the movie theater or whatever it is. If PTA meetings are now done on Zoom, it's unlikely that you're going to have that experience where you reach for the last donut at the same time someone else is reaching for the last donut, and the two of you strike up a conversation about, whether PVD donuts is better than Need, or Need is better than PVD, and then that blossoms into we meet for coffee, and suddenly you're friends. So it feels to me, I have to say, there are a lot of people who are optimistic that this is a moment that will spark a rebirth in interest in neighborly relations. I worry, on the other hand, that in fact we will learn that we can do a lot of things we used to be able to do through the middle rings, through the inner and the outer rings, and that is a net negative. But as I said, I don't feel confident in that conclusion of that prediction. I also, thought that Scott Walker was going to win the Democratic primary or the Republican primary 4 years ago. So what do I know?
Oh, Roz, I'm unmuting you so you can ask your question.
Well, I don't have a question. I just like to just throw another light on it, since I'm one of the senior citizens. And what lured me to come in here to even listen to this subject, of all of the subjects, that when I was teaching like communication skills to parents or kids, I would do levels of relationship, like what's appropriate to say and what's not appropriate to say, in terms of distancing and what we share and what do we keep. So I think that's why I came into the topic. But what I'm thinking that I want to share with you is what I think changed in neighborhoods, as witnessing it, is when women started to go back to work. When women weren't working and they were home, they had a lot of opportunity to socialize with the neighbors, and want that, because they needed to fill time and need. And when I look back, I think that living in Cranston is very different than living in Providence, besides the fact that we were the minority Jews in the neighborhood and in school. And my relationships with the neighbors were, if they were Jewish, we carpooled to Hebrew school or Sunday school. So we had, as alluded to, that single common interest, which I think still threads through my life now, what kept people together. But I think the big change with neighborhoods was with women going back to work and leaving, because there wasn't, even I ran a women's organization, or I always had people. it was so exciting because people wanted to do something for a common good and be interested in it. And as time went on and women went back to school and work, that kind of thing petered out. And I know with me, don't call me for coffee. I got to read my book. I went back to college. You know, we had other interests drawing. I don't want to put time in. And I think as we grew, my generation, we also didn't have to do things because we were supposed to. I don't have to be friends with my neighbor if she's a bore. Why do I have to do this? You know, I don't have to stand and hear "you people" or comments like that when I went for coffee with my neighbors. You know, like I was always, oh, is it the Jewish holiday yet? Or these kinds of things. I don't want to put myself in that situation. So I'm selective.
Well, it's a thought.
I loaded you up with a lot of stuff, I'm sure.
No, I appreciate that. You know, there have been so many remarkable changes over the second half of the 20th century. That's certainly the role that women played in the professional in the professional world changed. There was the digital change. There was globalization. There's been a whole variety of shifts. And the first several chapters of my book are about how all of these things played a role. It's very hard to disaggregate, you know, which ones played which. You know, the sort of there are certain suppositions. You know, one of the suppositions is that as women went back to work, people had dinner less frequently with their families. Well, the truth is that people have dinner less frequently with their families at home now. But in fact, people have dinner with their families more frequently. It's just that more often it's at restaurants. So we have senses of how things have shifted that both align in some cases with our notions of sort of how things have shifted, and then in some ways they cut against it. But you're absolutely right that the what I caught on what you said at the end, which was that why do you have to be friends with your neighbor if she's a bore? Right, that is a big shift, and that is in part it used to be that you had to be friends with your neighbor because in the case that someone got sick, you depended on your neighbor to help you, and now there's the Visiting Nurses Association, and your children can be in touch with you over FaceTime, and right, and there are all sorts of other ways to sort of scratch the itch that neighbors used to scratch. And so we don't have to depend on them, and in many cases we choose not to because they're boring or they're boorish or they're or they voted for the wrong candidate or they're right, whatever it is. And so all of those shifts have sort of combined to make it so that we're choosing to invest our time and attention in different social relationships.
Sam, did you want to?
Yeah. First of all, I enjoyed reading your book tremendously, and I appreciate your taking time to talk with us. And I guess I'll be interested in reading your article because I see, I'm very worried about what will come out of this. And I think that our virtual meeting here is kind of a sign of things to come. I'm worried that people are going to want to become virtual members of Temple Bethel. And they'll say, you know, look, I can get this all on my screen. Why do I have to go into the synagogue for this? And furthermore, why should I be paying all those dues when I can just, you know, have a visual experience? And, you know, I think with a lot of organizations, it's a lot easier to sit at your screen and kind of watch and maybe comment if you want, rather than go to meetings. And I'm wondering if you think that this social distancing is going to promote this technology, and the technology is going to make it is going to cause social capital to erode because people just won't want to go to meetings as much.
So here again, I mean, I think you're right to be worried. I don't have a clear sense of it. I think that like all of these things, it cuts both ways, right? That you're going to have people who can't afford to drive to see a psychotherapist or a therapist of any sort, don't have that kind of money. don't have that kind of time, but who are now able to zoom into a group conversation that didn't exist. And then that's going to be an incredible benefit, that more people will have access to that sort of community. There are people who are housebound who would never be able to participate in any sort of programming, who are now, as this becomes more the norm, are now going to have more interaction. I also think that there are going to be people who choose. You're absolutely right. Why should I pay X dues to some organization to be part to hear the Shema every Saturday morning when I could pay nothing? And there's a rabbi in Topeka who will do a service, and I can just watch that. And I think that I think things will shift. I do think we moved to Providence for an explicit reason, right? We were in Washington. We felt that it was cold. We felt that in our immediate experience, we didn't know the people around us. We could have moved to Bethesda or Falls Church or whatever it was, but we had some sense, having spoken to some friends, saying, we'd like to be in a place where people are more interconnected, that Providence might offer that. And so we gave it a shot. And I suspect that there will be, as there always is, people who want those sorts of relationships, who value the opportunity to raise their children or grow old or be young or whatever it is in places where they are connected to some element of diversity, some element of knowing their neighbors, and that will become sort of a coveted item, that people don't want to live totally alien from the people that are nearby. After my book came out, I became connected with the folks who are sort of in the executive ranks of a website called Nextdoor, which is a social network that is explicitly designed to connect people geographically. They have their own challenges. One of their challenges is that too often on Nextdoor, it'll become sort of just a place where people complain about those people who are coming into our neighborhood, whoever those people are. Or it'll be, I saw one of them coming and trying to break into my neighbor's house. That's a problem on Nextdoor. Of course, that's not a problem related to the technology. That's a problem that's connected to the sort of the norms of what Americans think about people from different racial groups, different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic circumstances, and it becomes exposed on Nextdoor. And the challenge, I think, for Nextdoor, and I've said this to them, is that you want it to be more than a place that you post. I've got an old mattress, mattress box to sell. You don't want it to become a Craigslist. You want people to have not only connect on Nextdoor, but then connect in real life, to actually have a barbecue, have a conversation, know one another when they stop in at the local coffee shop. So the Nextdoor by itself is not a replacement for community, but it can help. And the good news is the Nextdoor's numbers have exploded over the course of this crisis, right? That they're seeing engagement skyrocket because people are becoming much more attuned. And it may be that at the end of this thing, people realize, the people next door are really actually lovely, right? And I want to be in touch with them more frequently. And the hope, I think, is that we eventually come to some balance where people are able to take advantage of all the advantages of Zoom and the technology that became that makes this meeting possible. But also when, Sam, you give your next talk on your next book at Temple Bethel, everyone comes because the coffee's great and they want to talk to you in person.
That's certainly my hope as well. And I would love to believe that that this experience has made us miss each other's real presence and will draw us back. And actually having just bumped into Lynn out biking, the sense which was like, oh, wow, it's you in body and not on a flat screen was overwhelming. And I think we're all kind of missing that. Jessica Sherwood has one more question here that I'll read from the chat box. Chat box, excuse me. I'm curious what Mark thinks of this and whether anyone has experienced trying. Okay, it doesn't need to be. It's Jessica, can we unmute you? Can you explain this?
Yeah, hi.
I'm sorry, yeah.
I have so many thoughts that I thought I might have to like write a blog post or something after this, but
I'd like to read it.
National Neighborhood Day is the link that I tried to put in the chat box. Maybe it didn't come out clickable. So Mark, I don't know if you have experience with it or if anyone can speak to it.
So I'm aware of it. You know, the trick with, it seems to me, these middle ring relationships is that they're often done sort of almost in private, right? It's almost one-on-one, having a conversation at the corner about some topic and developing some sort of personal relationship. You know, I think National Neighborhood Day is terrific, and I think it's a great idea. Whether, you know, people, it spurs people to actually come out of their doors, talk on their porches, spend that time, I don't know. It feels, sometimes it strikes me as a little bit token. And really what ought to be done is there ought to be a norm. You know, I have this sort of idea that Leadership Rhode Island does this thing where they take alumni of the program and put them all together in what they call Jeffersonian dinners, where they have someone sort of do a moderated dinner where a bunch of people who may live near each other, they all certainly all live in Rhode Island, all come together at someone's house or at a restaurant, and there's a moderator who asks everyone to talk, and it's sort of it's a very structured conversation and it's designed explicitly to get people past the emotional and social barriers that prevent people from having more substantive conversation than they might otherwise have about the weather or you know, this pandemic or whatever it is, but to sort of reveal something about themselves. If National Neighbor Day became a day that was sort of like Thanksgiving, but for neighbors, where the norm and expectation was that people from around a neighborhood all got together and actually had a substantive interaction, that would be much more interesting to me. But it's it's different. And so I love the idea of a movement to build back neighborhood connections. I just think that it needs to be sort of, it requires a level of elbow grease probably among people who live near each other. That's different than sort of other sort of nationalized moments like that.
Excellent. Any last questions? Mark, thank you so much. It really is certainly a time to reflect on, yes, you see all the our neighbors and those who live near to us as we're kind of confined in our homes. It becomes that much more apparent. So we're grateful for your reflections. Thank you for sharing with us, and glad to see everybody's faces. Feel free to unmute and say hello. We are trying to have 3 pop-up classes at 4 o'clock each week, and we love that when our congregation can share with one another. It's really a joyful way to connect and something to look forward to at the end of the day. So if you have an idea, please do share with us, and much gratitude to Mark.
I'm gonna run to a 6-year-old's piano lesson virtually downstairs.
We'll let you do that. Thank you. Yes, Jordan, I agree. Also craving people. Take care, everybody. Good to see you, even on the screen. Yes, thanks, Mark. Take care.
Thanks.
You.